The evening sky over Abuja was heavy with clouds, the kind that promised a storm. Outside Walker Holdings Tower in Maitama, the glass walls reflected the flickering city lights as workers hurried home. Among the last to leave was Edward Walker, the billionaire whose name carried weight in every boardroom. Dressed in his signature black coat, he moved with cold efficiency, trailed by his assistants reciting tomorrow's meetings. To the world, Edward was untouchable. To himself, he was a man who never looked back. But then it happened. A small, trembling voice rose above the hum of the city. "Sir, please marry my mommy. She's all I got left." Edward froze mid-step. For a moment, he thought he imagined it, just the whisper of rain against the pavement. But when he turned, he saw her. A little girl, no older than 5, stood barefoot on the marble steps. Her thin dress was soaked through, clinging to her shivering frame. Curly hair plastered to her cheeks, wide brown eyes filled with both fear and determination. In one hand, she clutched a crumpled paper flower. With the other, she held onto Edward's sleeve as if her life depended on it. Security moved closer, uncertain. But the girl didn't run. She simply looked up at Edward and said, "My mommy is sick. Really sick. If you marry her, she won't die." The words hit him like a blow. Edward opened his mouth, but no sound came. For years, no one had dared speak to him with such innocence, such desperation. Before he could respond, a woman's voice cut through the drizzle. "Sophia, no. You can't just—" Edward's breath caught. The woman running toward them, limping slightly, her hair tied back in a tired bun, was Grace Martin. He knew that face. Once she had been the free-spirited young woman who painted dreams on canvases and laughed at the simplest things. 6 years ago, he had loved her recklessly, before he shattered her heart and disappeared. Now she stood before him, pale, worn, clutching the child to her chest, as though the world had already taken too much. For the first time in years, Edward's carefully built walls cracked, because this wasn't just any child. This was her child. And deep in his chest, a suspicion stirred. Perhaps she wasn't only hers. That night, in his Maitama penthouse, Edward Walker sat alone. The skyline of Abuja stretched endlessly before him. Towers of glass, blinking lights, the hum of a city that never stopped. It was the empire he had built, the kingdom he had conquered. Yet for the first time in years, victory tasted bitter. He couldn't shake the image of the little girl, barefoot, rain-soaked, clutching that paper flower. Sophia. Her voice still echoed in his ears. "Sir, please marry my mommy." But it wasn't only her words, it was her face. The tilt of her head when she was unsure, the furrow in her tiny brow. Her wide brown eyes carrying a kind of strength far beyond her years. It was all painfully familiar. Edward reached into his desk and pulled out a photo he hadn't looked at in years. It was worn at the edges, but still clear. Himself and Grace Martin, seated on the steps of the university library. Her hair had been wild in the wind, her smile pressed into his shoulder, her sketchpad resting on her lap. Back then she had spoken of opening an art school for children, of making beauty in a world that often ignored it. Edward stared at that photo for a long moment, then back toward his memory of Sophia. The resemblance was undeniable. Could it be? His phone buzzed, a message from his assistant. "We pulled public records on Grace Martin as you requested. One dependent. No listed spouse, no partner. Do you want a deeper report?" Edward's throat tightened. His thumb hovered over the screen, then typed, "Yes." Within minutes, the file appeared. Grace Martin, 29. Status unemployed, one dependent. Sophia Martin, age 5. Father not listed. Medical notes attached. Several emergency visits, symptoms of heart failure, no insurance. Edward's grip tightened on the printout. Grace was sick, truly sick, and she had been carrying it all alone, raising a child in silence, while her own body betrayed her. For the first time in a long while, fear, real fear, slipped beneath Edward's ribs. Not the fear of losing money, or power, or reputation, but the fear of what he had walked away from all those years ago. Grace wasn't just his past. Sophia wasn't just a stranger's daughter. If his suspicions were true, she was his. And now the truth was staring back at him, in the eyes of a little girl, brave enough to ask him to save the only person she had left. In a modest one-room apartment in Garkey Area 1, Grace Martin sat at the edge of a narrow bed. The night outside buzzed with the restless sounds of Abuja, generators humming, distant horns, the chatter of neighbors returning from late shifts. But inside, it was quiet. Too quiet. Beside her, Sophia slept soundly, curled up against her mother's arm, tiny breaths rising and falling with innocence, untouched by the weight her mother carried. Grace brushed a damp curl from her daughter's forehead, her heart swelling with both love and ache. When Sophia had run up to that man earlier, Grace's breath had stopped. Edward Walker. The one she had loved with a fire so reckless, it burned everything when he left. 6 years ago, he had vanished to London without goodbye, leaving her with nothing but questions and, weeks later, the startling truth growing inside her. She rose quietly, careful not to wake Sophia, and moved to the small wooden table near the window. On it lay her old sketch pad, the one thing she had refused to pawn even when money was short. Tonight she didn't draw, she wrote. "I saw him today," her shaky hand scrawled. Sophia touched his coat like she had every right to, and for a moment, I forgot how to breathe. He hasn't changed much. Still sharp. Still cold. But when he looked at her, something flickered. As if he knew. As if some part of him recognized her. She paused, pressing a hand against her chest, where the dull pain was growing stronger each week. The doctors had warned her. Heart failure. She needed treatment she couldn't afford. She should be resting, but rest was a luxury she didn't have. Bread had to be bought, school fees paid. How could she tell Edward the truth? How could she face the man who left her with silence and build a life from the pieces he shattered? How could she admit that the little girl he had looked at so strangely was not just her daughter, but his? Tears blurred her vision, falling onto the page, smudging her words. She shut the sketch pad quickly, afraid the truth inside might scream too loud if she lingered. She turned back toward Sophia, who shifted in her sleep, murmuring something unintelligible. Grace smiled faintly through her tears. Whatever happened, she had chosen her daughter. She would always choose her daughter, even if it meant burying the truth forever. But fate, she knew, had a way of unearthing secrets. And now that Edward had seen Sophia, Grace feared her carefully built walls were already beginning to crack. For 3 mornings in a row, Edward Walker found himself in the back seat of a black SUV, parked at quiet corners of Boost 2 and Garkey. He told himself it was only curiosity, only a need for answers. But in truth, he was watching the life he had abandoned without knowing. From behind tinted glass, he saw Grace, struggling with grocery bags far too heavy for her thin frame. He noticed how she winced slightly with every step, hiding the pain from her daughter. He followed them once to the pharmacy, where Grace bought only half of her prescription, leaving the rest behind because she couldn't afford it. And then there was Sophia. Each morning she skipped toward school, her shoes worn thin at the edges, her laughter ringing bright in the air. Edward's chest ached as he watched. She didn't know him. She didn't know that every smile reminded him of a life that could have been. But fate rarely waits for the perfect moment. That morning at the bus stop in Woosie 2, Sophia suddenly swayed. Her tiny body wobbled, and before anyone could react, she crumpled to the ground. "Sophia!" Grace screamed, dropping her bag, panic flooding her voice as she fell to her knees. Edward didn't think. The door of his SUV flew open and he was running, faster than he had run in years. Kneeling beside the child, he lifted her gently into his arms. Her head rested against his chest, her skin clammy and pale. Grace looked up, shock and fear colliding in her eyes. "Edward, what are you—" "I was nearby," he lied, his voice breaking as he brushed a strand of hair from Sophia's face. "You're safe, sweetheart. I've got you." For a moment, Sophia stirred. Her lips moved weakly, and a single word slipped out so faint it could have been a dream. "Daddy." Edward froze. The world seemed to stop spinning. Grace's gasp filled the air, but she didn't correct her. She didn't deny it. In that single broken word, everything changed. By the time they reached National Hospital, Abuja, Edward wasn't a billionaire anymore. He was a man holding his daughter for the very first time, terrified of losing her before he could even be part of her life. The white corridors of National Hospital Abuja smelled faintly of antiseptic and fear. Machines hummed, nurses hurried past, and yet the room felt unbearably still. Sophia lay curled on the bed, a drip line running into her tiny arm, her chest rising and falling steadily again. On one side of the room sat Edward Walker, motionless, his hand hovering over hers but not daring to touch. On the other side stood Grace Martin, arms folded tight across her chest, as though holding herself together with sheer will. The silence between them was louder than the beep of the monitors. Finally, Edward spoke, his voice low, rough. "Why didn't you tell me?" Grace's jaw tightened. She didn't look at him. "Because I didn't think it would matter." Edward rose slowly, his chair scraping against the tile. His eyes, dark with a mixture of pain and anger, locked on hers. "She's my daughter." Grace didn't confirm it. She didn't deny it either. She only turned toward the window where the rain streaked down the glass, mirroring the tears she refused to shed. "I found your file," Edward continued, softer now. "I know about the illness, the bills, the nights you went into urgent care alone. Grace, you're—" He stopped, his throat clenching. "You're dying, and you've been carrying this alone." Her head dropped, her voice breaking as she whispered, "You left me, Edward. You left without a word. No goodbye, no explanation, just gone. 2 weeks later, I found out I was pregnant, and I told myself I would never beg a man who chose to walk away." Edward's chest tightened like a vice. He had built empires, moved nations with contracts. Yet in that moment, he felt powerless. "I didn't know," he said hoarsely. "I didn't know, Grace." She turned then, slowly, painfully. Her eyes glistened, but her face was steady. "I know that now. But for years I thought maybe I wasn't enough. Maybe she wasn't enough. So I worked. I fought, even when my body gave up on me, because she was all I had." Her gaze shifted toward Sophia, asleep, fragile yet unbreakably brave. Edward stepped closer, his voice cracking. "She's smart. She's kind. She's braver than both of us." Finally, he let his hand touch Sophia's. "I want to be a part of her life, Grace. Whatever it takes, please, don't shut me out again." Grace didn't answer. But for the first time, she didn't stop him either. And that silence, heavy, trembling, uncertain, was the beginning of something new. The knock at the door of the small, Garky Area 1 apartment was soft, almost hesitant. Grace, still weary from long hours at the bakery and endless nights of worry, opened it cautiously. Standing there wasn't the cold billionaire she remembered, suited and guarded. Instead, Edward Walker wore a plain sweater, dark jeans, and carried a small paper bag in his hands. His voice was quiet, almost awkward. "I brought soup. Carrot. Sophia likes carrots, doesn't she?" Grace froze, narrowing her eyes. "How would you know that?" Edward only gave a faint, sheepish smile. "May I come in?" For a long moment she hesitated. Then, with a reluctant sigh, she stepped aside. The apartment was modest. Walls faded, sofa cushions worn, unpaid bills tucked discreetly under a book on the shelf. Yet it was warm, lived in, real. Edward noticed everything. The painting of a sunflower half finished on the wall, a stack of children's books by Sophia's bed, the little details that spoke of a mother's love and sacrifice. Grace busied herself in the kitchen, unpacking the soup in silence. Edward stood awkwardly in the living room until his eyes landed on a photo taped to the wall. Sophia on her 3rd birthday, frosting smeared across her nose, smiling at the camera. He swallowed hard. "You never told me," he said softer this time. Grace didn't look up. "I didn't think I could." "You were gone, Edward. I was scared. I had to protect her." He nodded slowly, guilt pressing heavy against his chest. "You should have been scared. I wasn't ready back then. I was selfish. I ran from everything." Her eyes flicked up to his, sharp but searching. "And now?" Edward took a step closer, his voice steady. "Now I don't just want to help. I want to stay. I want to be there for every school project, every fever, every art show. I want to earn her trust, and yours." From his pocket he pulled out a small key. He didn't offer a diamond or a grand promise, just a key. "It's to a home I bought today, in Asokoro, close to her school, with sunlight for your paintings. I'm not asking for a yes. I'm asking for a chance to try." Grace stared at the key, her heartbeat racing. Fear and hope warred inside her. This wasn't a fairy tale. This was life, messy, uncertain, fragile. Finally, she reached out and took it. Not as a promise, but as a maybe. And for Edward, that was enough. The smell of warm bread still clung to Grace Martin's clothes as she walked home from her bakery shift in Garki. The late afternoon sun was kind, painting the sky in soft gold. In her hand, she carried a brown paper bag filled with strawberry buns, a promise she had made to Sophia after school. For the first time in years, Grace felt a sliver of peace. Edward had been showing up lately, not with grand gestures, but in small, steady ways. He had helped Sophia finish her science project, repaired the curtain rod without being asked, even joined them at Millennium Park on Sunday to fly kites. Grace found herself breathing easier, as though life might finally be turning. But fate is cruel when it wants to test the heart. As she rounded the corner to their apartment complex, the ground seemed to shift beneath her. A sharp pain gripped her chest, searing and relentless. The bag slipped from her hands, buns scattering across the pavement. She clutched her chest, gasping. Then her legs buckled. "Somebody help!" a woman cried from the roadside. Moments later, paramedics surrounded her. In her purse, they found a small, worn envelope marked in shaky handwriting. "In case of emergency, Edward Walker." 20 minutes later, Edward stormed into the National Hospital Abuja lobby, his tie loose, his face pale with fear. "Where is she?" he demanded. "Are you family?" the nurse asked, scanning the clipboard. "Yes," Edward said without blinking. "I'm the only one she has." They let him through. Grace lay unconscious, fragile against the stark white of the hospital bed. Tubes ran from her arms, machines beeping steadily, but her stillness terrified him. She looked nothing like the strong woman who had carried life alone for years. She looked like someone slipping away. The doctor pulled Edward aside, his tone grave. Her heart is failing. We can stabilize her for now, but she needs immediate surgery and a donor heart. We have a match. But the financials and consent must be signed right away. The words blurred in Edward's mind, but his response was clear. He grabbed the clipboard, signing every line without hesitation. Money had never mattered less. What mattered was the woman he had once lost, and the daughter they shared who couldn't afford to lose her. This time, Edward Walker wasn't walking away. The sterile hum of machines filled the dim corridor of National Hospital, Abuja. Hours felt like days as Edward Walker sat slouched in a plastic chair outside the operating theater. His expensive coat lay forgotten over his knees, his eyes red and hollow. For once, the billionaire who commanded boardrooms and bent markets to his will was utterly powerless. On the small couch across the room, Sophia had finally fallen asleep. Curled beneath a hospital blanket, she clutched a stuffed elephant Edward had rushed to buy from the gift shop downstairs. Her face was blotchy from crying, yet peaceful in sleep, a reminder of the innocence he had already missed too much of. Inside the theater, surgeons worked to replace the failing heart of the woman he had once let slip away. The woman who had raised his daughter alone. The woman he now realized he had never stopped loving. Edward's phone buzzed endlessly with calls from directors, investors, even his sister, Emily Walker. He ignored them all. Tonight there was only one deal that mattered. The fight for Grace's life. Finally, after what felt like eternity, the surgeon emerged. Edward shot to his feet, every muscle tense. The transplant went well, the doctor said, weary but hopeful. Her new heart is strong. She'll need time, care, and constant monitoring, but she has a chance. Edward exhaled sharply, tears burning at the corners of his eyes. For the first time in years, he whispered a prayer of gratitude. Hours later, when Grace stirred weakly in the recovery room, Edward was still at her side. He gripped her hand, afraid to let go as her lashes fluttered open. Her voice was raspy, barely a whisper. Edward, you stayed. His throat tightened. I'm not leaving again. Not now, not ever. She turned her head slightly toward Sophia, still curled in her chair. Is she safe? She's here. She's been drawing, waiting for you. Edward reached into his coat pocket and pulled out a folded sheet of paper, a vow he had written in the long hours of waiting. His voice trembled as he read, You gave me what I never knew I needed. Purpose. A daughter, a second chance. I walked away once. I won't again. Not with promises, but with presence. Let me stay. Let me build this life with you. With her. With us. Tears slid down Grace's cheeks, soaking into the pillow. She didn't speak. She didn't need to. The gentle squeeze of her hand in his was answer enough. For Edward Walker, the storm had finally broken, and for the first time, the sun was beginning to rise. It wasn't a grand cathedral or a luxury hall in Maitama. Instead, the wedding took place in a quiet corner of Millennium Park's community art garden, where Grace had once taught children to paint under the shade of trees. The air was alive with color, sunlight streaming through vines, wildflowers swaying in the breeze, laughter echoing like music. Grace stood beneath a simple wooden arch wrapped in a white ribbon. Her dress wasn't satin or lace from Paris, but soft ivory cotton that flowed gently to her ankles. In her hair, instead of jewels, was a paper flower, the same one Sophia had proudly made the night before. She looked radiant, not because of wealth or fashion, but because she had survived and chosen to live. At the other end of the aisle waited Edward Walker, not in a designer tuxedo, but a soft gray suit with a lily pinned to his lapel. He stood with a quiet smile, the kind that came not from triumph, but from gratitude. Beside him, barefoot and crowned with flowers, was Sophia, clutching her tiny basket of petals. As Grace walked forward, every step felt like rewriting a story that almost ended too soon. She reached Edward, and without words, he reached for her hand. She gave it freely. The officiant, a family friend from the art center, kept the ceremony short and sincere. But the vows, those carried more weight than any legal papers ever could. Edward went first. His voice trembled, but was firm. I thought love was about grand gestures. But you taught me it's in the little things. Soup when you're sick, a hand when you're scared, staying when it's hard. I don't deserve this second chance, but I will spend the rest of my life proving I know what a gift it is. Grace followed, her eyes glistening. You were once the boy I lost, but now you are the man who came back, not just with apologies, but with love for a child you never knew, and for the woman I became without you. You came back not with pity, but with presence, and that is what I choose. Sophia, grinning wide, whispered, not so quietly, Now kiss. Laughter rippled through the small gathering, and as Edward and Grace kissed, the weight of years fell away. It wasn't about erasing the past, it was about rewriting the ending. The reception was simple. Home-cooked meals from Grace's friends, children chasing each other through the grass, music carried on the evening breeze. There were no chandeliers, no orchestras, just family, love, and the promise of a future built not on wealth but on presence. For Edward, Grace, and Sophia, this wasn't a fairy tale ending. It was something rarer. A second chance that almost never was, now fully theirs to keep.